Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly discussion series that's hosted by the Chaldean Cultural Center in collaboration with U of M Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. I'm your host, Am Nemu, and this month we are celebrating Jewish Heritage Month, and we have Ariel Sabar with us today. Welcome, Ariel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Ariel is an author and journalist. He is a winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for autobiography. In his debut book, My Father's Paradise, Sabar, who grew up in Los Angeles, travels with his father to a war-torn Iraq in a quest for his roots and reconciliation. A sweeping saga of Iraqis, Kurdish, and Jewish history, My Father's Paradise is also an intimate story of history and hope. So as I had mentioned, Ariel, when I emailed you, so this is the first copy I received to review in 2008. It even says advanced reading copy. That's how long it's been.
Which that one has all the spelling errors in it.
Oh, does it? Okay, I didn't catch them. No worries. I was just so fascinated by what I was learning that I was really intrigued by this story. I did a book review for it, for the Multicultural Review. And what was just very intriguing is that, as a Chaldean, and my parents were born in northern Iraq in the village of Telkepe. I was born in Baghdad. They moved to Baghdad once they were married. But the descriptions that you were offering was of our people. The language, the Aramaic language, the same pronunciations, the similarities was incredible, but also the traits that the people had. So, and then I ended up learning so much at that time because I did not know that there were Kurdish Jews that spoke Aramaic. I re-listened, this time in an audiobook, I was listening to it and I was learning more things because it's been a while since I read it. And so it was intriguing that the way the story is told, but all the details and the historical facts that are involved in it. But, so tell our audience a little bit, what is the book about and how far back you go with your ancestors when you're sharing these stories?
Yeah, so I was a long time daily journalist, and I decided to quit my job at the Baltimore Sun in 2004 because I felt like there was this really important story slipping through my fingers, and it was really the story of my father's immigrant journey from the mountains of Kurdish Iraq to Los Angeles, where I grew up.
Ariel, I don't want to interrupt you, but there's a little bit of static from your computer. If
do you want me to put on some headphones, or
usually it works better without headphones. Let's see. When I was talking to you before that, it was fine. You can. Let's see. Okay. You want to try the headphones and see? Let me see. We lost him for a second. Okay, I think he's gonna try to come back on. Hello.
Can you see me now?
Yes, and the sound is good. So
okay, sorry.
That's fine. Let's try this again. Go ahead and please tell us about your book.
Yeah, so just to start again, I was a daily journalist. I was working at the Baltimore Sun, and I decided to quit my job in 2004 because I felt like there was this really important story that I needed to tell, and that was the story of my father's immigrant journey from this really almost Stone Age place in the mountains of Kurdistan. He was, born in a mud shack to illiterate parents. His mother was like 14 years old. When he was born, and then he somehow becomes this like acclaimed professor at UCLA, like in Los Angeles, a place that's sort of blazing towards the future. And I really felt like I needed to be able to tell that story, both to preserve, our family story, but also the very like poorly understood story of the Jews of Kurdistan. And I felt like if and the language they spoke, Aramaic, which was this 3,000-year-old language spoken by Christians and Jews, also famously, the language of Jesus, and that it was still being spoken by people in my father's town of Zaho in northern Iraq. And I thought it would be a remarkable story, but I also, I hope that at some level it would do exactly what you said it apparently did, which was to sort of connect to other people in other places and to speak for the more kind of universal experience of what happens when you leave kind of an ancient land where these traditions are so fixed and rooted, and you're living in isolation, and then moving to the modern world, and sort of what is it you get to take with you from that other place that still means something in the new place where you've landed. And so my father's paradise was a journalist's effort to sort of chronicle that giant sort of personal immigrant story, but also the history of the Kurdish Jews and of Aramaic. And then also, why did I do it? Because I felt like when I was growing up in Los Angeles, I really rejected my father. I wanted to be this all-American kid, surfer boy, skateboarder, listening to, playing in a rock band, playing drums in a rock band, trying to look cool. And my dad, couldn't figure out how to dress in the morning. He never went to a barber. He talked with a funny accent. I just kind of like kept my distance from him. And I felt like once my own son was born, I really needed to do something both as a son and as a writer to connect these very different generations.
It's just amazing the generations that have passed. But I was on a program last week that talking about the Chaldean Cultural Center, and one of the questions the host asked me is, why is it important for people to know their roots and their heritage? And I said, well, I know a lot of Chaldeans. We've even done interviews where some younger Chaldeans have said that they have denied their heritage because they were embarrassed by it, especially when they were younger. And it took a long time, whether when they became parents or when they got much older and they started understanding the value of what it was to be a Chaldean or to be from an indigenous person from Mesopotamia. Then they started valuing it, but just that shame and this feeling that they carried with them. And then again, when you were describing it in your book, when you were talking about how you felt about with your dad, just the similarities, it was very refreshing to read. I think a lot of our stories, another thing that happens is that they're not told by us. It's like somebody is studying the Jewish Kurdish community and writing about it. But from you, it came from the heart. It was just so honest when the way that you were describing your community and your people. And, what I'd like to share in the book, what makes it very interesting is that the storytelling is so powerful that it's easier to learn about the history. But tell us a little bit about the Kurdish Jews in Iraq, because I've talked to people who have said, no, there's no Kurdish Jews. This is, and I said, no, I've read about them. And they said, no, there's no such a thing. I mean, I don't know if maybe there is no such a thing now, but tell us about the history and where they're at now, if there's any left.
The oral tradition of the Kurdish Jews is that, if you read the Bible, there are two big exiles from ancient Israel. There's the Babylonian exile, which is fairly well known. And then about 150 years before that, there was the Assyrian exile. So the Assyrian sort of empire, which happened to have control of this little strip of land that was ancient Israel at the time, they did across their empire just to sort of like assert their power and to destabilize the region. They basically did something called population exchange, is where they took a group of people from the land that they had been in for many, many years and then moved them across the empire to somewhere completely different in hopes that they would just basically be sort of helpless and at the mercy of their new rulers. And so they did that to the Jews of ancient Israel the same way they did it to other people across the Middle East. And they took the Jews from Assyria and they marched them across hundreds of miles of desert, and then planted them in the region that was then called Assyria. But if you look at what Assyria was then, and you kind of plot it on modern maps, it's not exact, but it's pretty close. It basically tracks with what the region we today call Kurdistan, which is a giant crescent-shaped territory arcing through the mountains of Syria, Iraq, Turkey, Iran. And so the Kurdish Jews basically are the Jews that were, I mean, their tradition is that they were the Jews exiled from ancient Israel in 722 BC, and they didn't go anywhere. They just stayed exactly where the Assyrians had put them, up in the mountains. They didn't sort of scatter. They didn't go to other places. They just stayed precisely where they were placed. And, you know, the Bible, of course, writes these Jews off as the lost tribes, and almost as these kind of literary figments, as symbols of this like irrecoverable Jewish past that we'll never get back. You know, they vanished into thin air. But the Jews of Kurdistan, or the Assyrian exile, were really never lost. They just, as you said, like people just weren't looking up in those mountains to see like who actually was living up there, because they were kind of outside of the mainstream of Judaism. And so the Jews lived in these villages scattered across Kurdistan. There are about 200 villages. About in my father's day, right before the mass migration to Israel, there are only about 25,000 Jews living in the Kurdish regions of Iraq, Iran, Syria. About 18,000 of those 25,000 were in Iraq. And my father was in a town called Zacha, which was on the Habur River. And again, the Habur River is mentioned in the Bible as part of Assyria. So it's like all of the descriptions in the Bible kind of line up with pretty much like the town my dad grew up in. And so, and they spoke Aramaic because it had once been the language of the Assyrian Empire. And they just continued speaking it even after the Islamic conquest, when the rest of the Middle East switched over to Arabic, because these were Arabian rulers and they imposed their own language, and Arabic was the language. So Arabic stuck. In fact, the Jews who grew up or who lived in Baghdad spoke Arabic. In fact, the Jews who lived in Mosul spoke Arabic. But if you went up into the mountains where they didn't get the memo that, hey guys, we're not speaking Aramaic anymore, we're speaking Arabic, they continued to speak Aramaic up until the present day. And the tragedy, of course, is that in most communities, both Jewish and Christian, Aramaic is pretty much in its final days. Parents are not really teaching it to their children as a spoken language. Of course, it's part of the liturgy in the Assyrian church, I believe in the Chaldean church as well. It's very much a religious language, but to sort of like, hey, Mom, can I go to the mall this weekend? You're not going to be asking that in Aramaic. It's just it's pretty much in its dying days, which is what's driven my father to devote his career as a scholar at UCLA to really preserving his own dying mother tongue, and that's been his own labor of love.
So, can you tell us a little bit about the difference between the Aramaic, your ancestral Aramaic, which, like I said, this is what the Chaldeans speak, and the Assyrians, and when there were the words, the Chaldean words or the Aramaic words in the book, I'm like, this is exactly how we say gurgur, just look, so I was laughing at times at the exact pronunciation of it. But what's the difference between that Aramaic and the Aramaic of the Talmud?
It's just a question of time. You think of like Old English versus Middle English versus Modern English. It evolves, the pronunciations change, some of the meanings are slightly different, but it's basically just an evolution. It's another phase of the same language. So the language that my father spoke growing up, and that you may have spoken, is basically like lumped together into this catch-all of Neo-Aramaic, which basically means the spoken form of Aramaic that survived the Islamic conquest. So it's mostly spoken, it's not standardized, which is why, you walk from one village to the next and like they're speaking a slightly different version of Aramaic. Sometimes it's called Syriac, which is sort of the Christian dialect. Sometimes it has other other names, Sarani. I mean, that's right. So that's Kurdish, but it sometimes has other names. And so, but basically, these are all versions of Neo-Aramaic, which is the final spoken form of Aramaic. And it has like more than 100 dialects, because unlike like literary languages, which are sort of formalized over time and calcified as scribes and authors kind of write things, they sort of decide on, well, this is how we're going to say this word, this is how we're going to spell this particular word. Aramaic, Neo-Aramaic, really it's like village to village. There's like slight variations in the meanings of words that are really fascinating for linguists to study this stuff.
So, was your grandfather that was living in Mosul when you start the story? Was it
I had an uncle. So yeah, my father's family were all from Zaha.
From Zaho?
But we did have an uncle in Mosul who ran a famous kebab shop. Sion Kebabchi was the place. Basically, it means like Sion the kebab guy. And he was like very well known. He had like it was like a food truck. It was very popular. And you would go there and get kebabs. And the cool thing, I mean, this is another example of the way in which one of the reasons the book is called My Father's Paradise is because my father really remembered it as a place where Jews and Muslims and Christians got along for a very long time. Of course, the Christian experience did wind up being different in the 20th century, but the Jews were sort of in this sort of sweet spot where they did get along with everybody. And whether it was Muslims stubbing their cigarettes in respect as Jews filed home from the synagogue on Saturdays, or Muslims bringing the Jews gift baskets at the end of Passover. And for instance, Sion in Mosul, he would bring. There was a lot of collaboration between the Jews and the Muslims in his day, and so it really, for my father, that those relations between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and that before kind of all of the terrible ideologies of the 20th century, were one of the reasons he came to see it as a kind of paradise. And I'll caveat by saying that he came to see it as a paradise through the eyes of a boy. I mean, when he was 13, at the very moment that Jewish law declared him a man, basically at the point of his bar mitzvah, he and his family joined the massive exodus of Jews from Iraq to Israel. In fact, he was the last boy bar mitzvah in his hometown. And so
that's what I was going to ask you about next, is that you do talk about that, about the friendships that were there. And again, the similarities, what I experienced, this is why we experienced, like my family and I, there was so much trauma when we came, because we did leave fairly, there wasn't the things that happened afterwards, especially after the worst 2003 when we left, and it was more for political reasons.
Sure.
But some of the things, if you can describe what led your family, kind of, they weren't forced in the same way maybe that Christians were, but there was a shift that was occurring too.
Yeah, it was a really complicated decision for the Jews of all the Islamic lands, because in Europe, of course, you had the Holocaust, and everyone knew why you were leaving and why you had to get out quickly. And I mean, this was just homicidal and barbaric on a scale rarely ever seen before in history. And so some people said that Israel was a European solution to a European problem, and in some ways that's true, because the Jews who lived in Islamic lands, while they certainly were not the majority, in Baghdad, for instance, in the 20th century, 1 out of 3 Baghdadis was Jewish. There were Jews on the high court, there were Jews on the highest levels of business, there were Jews in government, and there wasn't the same urgency to sort of flee that there was in Europe. And so a lot of the Jews had mixed feelings about whether they needed to go. They certainly supported Israel. They certainly identified as Jews. They wanted to support the new state, but did they really have to move there to do that? And I think what happened is, with the War of Independence, suddenly these sharp lines were drawn, and there was a twin rise of Zionism on the one hand, and then Pan-Arabism on the other, which is the sort of stronger Arab identity that was defined sort of in opposition to Zionism. And you had friends, neighbors, business partners who had gotten along for all these centuries suddenly started to look at each other a little bit more suspiciously, which I think was a horrible shame. And then those divisions were sort of like encouraged and preyed on and fueled by ideologues. And in Israel too, Israel wanted these Jews from the Middle East to come to Israel because they needed people. I mean, there was one famous early Jewish leader who said, for thousands of years we've been a people without a land. Now we're at risk of being a land without people. And so there were huge Jewish populations in the Middle East that they needed to come. They wanted to come very much. So, the Israelis too started sort of facilitating and encouraging and creating secret migration routes out of the Middle East, out of these Arab lands into Israel. And so my father, was not part of the very first wave of Jews who left, but probably like this one among the second or third in that period from 1948 to 1951, when Jews were deciding, do we stay or do we go?
And so our understanding is that there's a strong community of Iraqi Jews in Israel. Are you aware of whether this group is composed of Kurdish Jews and whether they have tried to maintain the Aramaic language?
Yeah, I mean, so most of the Iraqi Jews in Israel and anywhere are going to be not Kurdish, because the Kurdish they were a minority within a minority. So the majority of Iraqi Jews are probably like from the Baghdad area, from the bigger cities. And I mean, just a rough statistic, like if you say 135,000 Jews in all of Iraq in 1950, maybe 18,000 of those were Kurdish. So maybe 10 to 15%, something in there. And that's probably largely reflected in Israel's Iraqi Jewish population as well. So most of the Iraqi Jews in Israel would have, their ancestors, and maybe some of themselves, would have spoken Arabic at the time that they migrated. And so the Kurdish Jews, they're scattered. There are many in Jerusalem, of course, like where my own grandparents lived in basically like a slum tenement when they moved to Israel. And then you have some Kurdish moshavs and kibbutzim. This is a form of communal living, and in a way, because these kibbutzes, these Kurdish kibbutzes in Israel are more isolated, they've done a better job of kind of keep maintaining some of their traditions and some of their language. I don't have a lot of optimism that it's going to that it's actively being taught to the next generation. Of course, Hebrew is the language of Israel. That's what people speak. Are there probably some young people who are really interested in Aramaic that their grandmothers and their great grandmothers and great grandfathers spoke? Yeah, probably, and some of them might be making some sort of in-house efforts to sort of learn some phrases. But are there places in Israel where Aramaic is being exclusively spoken? No. I mean, the language is really in its last days, sadly, and I think that lends some of the urgency to the work that linguists are doing now to record these people who still speak the language before they're gone for good. And it also inspired me because I felt like I wanted to be able to tell this story while Jews who had lived, who remembered life in Kurdistan, were still alive. I didn't want to rely on books. First of all, there aren't really that many books. Maybe my dad wrote one of them, but there isn't a lot out there that you can draw on. I really felt like as a journalist, I wanted to go deep and really spend time with this community and understand who they were, what they cared about, why their language was important, their customs and traditions, and then tell, on top of that, a very American story of an American-born child trying to make sense of this faraway past.
So at some point, aside from the research that you did, and how many years, by the way, did it take to write this book?
Well, I quit my job in 2004, and the book was published in 2008, and I probably it's in like 4 to 5 years.
4 to 5 years.
Yeah, full time. I wasn't doing anything else.
So tell us a little bit about, at some points involved in the research, you ended up visiting Iraq, correct? What year did you visit Iraq? And tell us what that experience was like.
Yeah, I went back in 2005 and 2006. I really felt like in order to tell this story in Technicolor, I needed to go there. My dad's a scholar. He's great with books and manuscripts and all that kind of stuff. I need to go and see stuff with my own eyes. And I really wanted to visit. And my father, to be honest, wasn't particularly crazy about the idea because, this is 2005. There was an insurgency in Iraq. And the idea of like 2 American Jews going back to Iraq in the middle of an insurgency on a kind of sentimental journey, my dad's like, I don't think so. It's not a great timing is not great here. Plus, you didn't care about this for your first, 32, 33 years. Like, why are you suddenly so interested? He was a little bit suspicious. And I basically said, like, I'm going to go anyway because I need to see this place. I can't tell the story without going to Zapo. He said, okay, I'll go with you because if anything happened to you because you didn't understand the culture, you didn't understand the language, that would be on me as a father. I'm like, yes. So I basically guilt baited him, which I'd done a lot of, and I knew it worked, and he came, and it was really cool because, like, yeah, we were kind of anxious, we were stressed. We flew into Diyarbakir in southeastern Turkey, and then took a very harrowing high-speed taxi ride from the Diyarbakir airport all the way down to the Iraqi border, dodging sheep and and other obstacles on the road, like fuel trucks. It was a very frightening 4-hour taxi ride. But we got there, and like as soon as we crossed the border, it was like we were stepping into that paradise that my father had spoken of. Because almost as soon as we arrived on the other side, a man who had been there, from an older man who knew the community, was waiting for us, and he embraced us, and he said, "Welcome back to your town." And that was like, I just felt like I got a lump in my throat, because to think that someone there would say, "This is my town," or that I had some legitimate reason to be even visiting, to me was very moving. And I was really grateful to be able to tour the village, to see my father's old house and the Jewish neighborhood, and the market where my grandfather ran his shop where he dyed clothing. It was just really, really profoundly moving. And then I went back another time on my own. My dad didn't want to go back again. He's like, "I've done that. You've done it. You know what it looks like. If you want to go back, you got to go back on your own." And part of that was to try to understand this mystery of what happened to my father's older sister, who was kidnapped as a baby, basically. And I don't want to ruin anything, but it's in My Father's Paradise. If people are curious, they can read more about
What
that.
year was the second time that you visited?
Yeah, I went back a year later, so 2000.
Oh, a year later. Okay, it was very shortly afterward. Yeah, and I have to say, your humor now even reminds me. There's a lot of humor in this book. I think it comes from the honesty. I love. I visited Iraq in 2000, and my mom was always telling me, "Just wait when things get better." And I said, "Mom, things are never going to get better in that land." Like I had waited and waited, and like 20 years after we had left, I thought it's not going to get better. And thank God I went when I did, because even though the country was under sanctions, but the war hadn't started. And it's interesting that you were safely able to go and come back. I know that when we were trying to research the Iraqis, the Jewish Iraqis in Iraq, about a year ago, we found out that there were 4 individuals that were left, one who had passed away, and we weren't able to really track down their names, they said, because of just safety purposes.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate, because this is also the similarities in our communities, I think, what has occurred and how we have dealt with the immigration process, and how your dad, despite where he came from, that he really created such a legacy for himself, and the kind of work that he did. It's amazing. Like, where is your dad today?
Yeah, so he was a professor at UCLA for many, many years. He retired, but fully retired in 2019. And in 2021, we moved him and my mom closer to us here in Washington, D.C. So they're about a 25-minute drive away, which is wonderful. We can see them in their retirement community and get to spend a ton of time with them, and they get to see their grandkids a lot. And so it's really come full circle.
Very dedicated to his work. And again, like my dad, same thing, when he came, though he did, for my father, he became depressed because again, we had to leave the situation, but it's like it's always in our hearts, regardless of what had taken place.
Yes.
When you were visiting Iraq, did you come across the communities, the Assyrian and Chaldean communities in the northern Iraq? Were you ever, I'm imagining that there was a large community at that time, or what was it like when you went? Did you get to meet?
We did not encounter Chaldeans during our trip, although they were there. We had such limited time that we were really focused on kind of researching our own story. However, the cool thing is that not long after I got back, or not long after my book was published, I was really curious to learn more about the Aramaic-speaking Christians of the Middle East. And so I kind of talked, I was a freelancer for Smithsonian Magazine, which is the magazine of the Smithsonian institutions here in Washington, D.C. I said, look, there are some really interesting linguists out there, like a generation younger than my father, who are going door to door in these American communities where Assyrians and Chaldeans, Nestorians, I know they have different names for different parts of that community, are still, the elderly community still speaks Aramaic. And I would like to, there's a very famous scholar from Cambridge University named Jeffrey Kahn. He's an expert in the dialects of Aramaic. He's coming to Chicago to go into some of the old high rises around Chicago to interview like 80 and 90-year-old Assyrians and Chaldeans to learn just basic, more like about all the very different dialects. Like literally, like he wants to document all 100 dialects of Aramaic.
Yeah,
so it was really cool.
Interviewed him, by the way. We interviewed him, I think, in 2020, and he's been doing this, like he had been doing this already for so many years.
Yeah, so
we were even able to learn quite a bit from him because we started what's called the digital storytelling, where we focus on the elderly speaking the Aramaic language. And you're right, it is dying. You can tell that even though we have classes and such, and people are trying to speak it, but I have kids that I try to teach to, and they have a different attitude. They probably have the attitude that I had towards my parents and you had towards your parents, and it can't be really forced. So you see that this is happening, and there's this sense of, for me, like keeping the language or even learning currently, like reading and writing it, it's really, there's just a personal sense to it. And you can't really control where it's going to go. So I'm sure that this was how did this affect your life? The book and the journeys that you took, how did it transform your life or impact your life in any way?
I mean, at a most basic level, it brought my father and I closer together because we for the first time in our lives, like I couldn't avoid him. I had to spend time with him, and I found I rather enjoyed it. And I was learning just a ton about his story. He happens to have a really great memory, which is great luck for a journalist. Because I could spend hours and hours with him, going really deep on parts of his past and stories from his childhood and about leaving Iraq and about, his first experiences as a teenager in Israel. And so it gave us like a common ground that we didn't have before, because all of a sudden, like I was working on a book about his story and we needed each other, and I couldn't pretend that I didn't need him anymore because I didn't need him. And then that excuse actually brought us, I think, like emotionally closer, and we had a kind of vocabulary that we never had before, because while I was off skateboarding and playing drums and he was holed up in his home office, crouched over some ancient text that he was trying to decipher, that was hard. But now, like, we were kind of working on a project together that was deeply meaningful to both of us, and we suddenly had something to talk about, and that continues to be the case. We often talk about the grandkids or whatever now, but we're also often talking about, he'll send me some recent article about Aramaic, or I'll tell him that there's someone who's interested in a young person who's maybe doing a PhD dissertation and they want to talk to him. And so it really created this this fabric, this web that connects us that we didn't have before. And then I think the other thing that's been really cool is just to remind my own kids that, yeah, they're growing up all American in many ways, but they need to understand that this didn't happen by accident, that they have these ties, these connections halfway across the globe. And that whenever we look at anybody, whether it's an immigrant, a migrant, someone who's crossed a border, we need to understand how challenging that journey has been, and we need to see ourselves in their experience. And so that's been something cool to be able to try to inculcate in my kids as well.
So Ariel, you've written other books as well, and one of your recent book, Veritas, is that how am I
Veritas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a Harvard professor, a con man, and the Gospel of Jesus' Wife was considered one of the best books of 2000. Was it 20? I think I have
20, yeah, 2020.
Okay, by Smithsonian Magazine, Christian Science Monitor, and the Minneapolis Star Tribune. So without getting too controversial, what is this book about? Because I was just
it's a really
interesting, the title in itself. And did that also take up a lot of research and such?
It was, yeah. That was an investigative story into this really bizarre case, a Christian story of a Harvard professor in 2012, very famous Harvard historian of early Christianity, made an announcement across the street from the Vatican in 2012 that she had discovered a tiny scrap of papyrus in which, written in the ancient Egyptian language of Coptic. which is the language of Jesus of Egypt's earliest Christians, and that this tiny scrap of papyrus, while it was fragmentary, had Jesus referring to a wife. There's a famous line in the middle of the papyrus says, "Jesus said to them, my wife," and this would have been like the first manuscript from antiquity in which Jesus speaks to a wife, and of course, would be of extraordinary importance for Christianity and the all-male, celibate priesthood and the role of women in church, and it would have a lot of sort of implications. And I happened to be, again, assigned by Smithsonian Magazine to travel with this scholar to Rome when she made this announcement. And I was the only journalist in the room when she did so. And then what winds up happening over the next 3 years is this crazy unraveling in which, partly through my investigative journalism, partly through the hard work of scholars of Coptic, came to discover that this papyrus fragment was an audacious forgery executed by an internet pornographer living in rural Florida. It's just a wild, like a crazy story. I think very gripping. It's a thriller. If you're interested in like obscure Christian texts, scriptures that did not make the New Testament, or just the controversies around sexuality in Christianity and women in Christianity. It's a really rich book that I think has a lot to chew on, and is just, I think, a page turner. So if you're looking for another Ariel Sabar,
yes, because you are very crafty with that, keeping the pages turning while we're learning something. That's kind of rare, right?
In tone, it's a very, very different book from My Father's Paradise, but it also, I think, in some ways, I'm really interested in what happens on the margins of religion, the stuff you don't hear about. Like your friend who said, there aren't any Jews in Kurdistan.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's fascinating.
Very confidently.
That means that people haven't done enough work looking around. In the same way, this is a story about these forgotten texts of Christianity. In fact, there are many that are authentic. Now, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, these are all authentic texts. But occasionally, a very crafty person will come along and try to introduce a lost gospel into the lost text of Christianity that tries to rewrite history in some way. So that was another story that was fascinating for me because it's taking place kind of on the margins rather than in the center of religion.
And are you working on anything right now?
Yeah, I'm working on another story. I'm working on a story for the Atlantic magazine. I can't talk too much about it because they swear me to secrecy, but it's among the themes we've discussed today. So again, these ideas, margins of faith, investigation, trying to understand people for whom faith means something different than what you might, your Sunday school teacher or the preacher might tell you from the pulpit. And because religion is, I think people react to religion in so many fascinating ways and draw so many different things from it. And I'm interested in how people make sense of their faith and their ancestry and their traditions. So stay tuned.
When do you think that's going to be out, Ariel?
Probably very late this year or early next year.
Oh, okay, soon.
Yeah.
So
it's a monthly magazine, so it takes
maybe
longer.
Maybe next year we'll have you back with that book or that story.
Okay.
So thank you so much. Until then, I continue. All these years when I was doing stories or sharing stories, I always brought up this book because, again, the things that it was saying in it, and because of the fact that similarly to the Jewish Kurdish community, the Chaldean community also lacks, and there's like a void with regards to sharing stories for many, many reasons. So even with our digital storytelling, part of it is not just to preserve and to document the Chaldean language, but it's also to share our stories, many of which we were not able to share because everybody, as you saw in this book, is in survival mode. That last thing is for them to think is like to document everybody, everything down, although there were some characters that really cared to constantly carry books. So thank you so much for the work that you do. I look forward to your next project, and we loved having you today. Really appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it as well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the remarkable work that your center does and for cultural preservation, which is so hugely important. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for watching, and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.